And of course, the WHO, when it provides emergency use listing for a vaccine, is constantly collecting and tracking this information. At any time, if we feel that a vaccine is not performing satisfactorily, then there's always the option of revoking that. But as of now, the data that we've seen convinces us that the vaccines are protecting people and that they must continue to be used.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya. One of our viewers is also asking, as we have different types of vaccines, are some types stronger in their protection against variants, or they all are having the same strength against different variants?
That's a really good question, and I think it's a question that we must continue to look at and do research on. What we do know is that the different vaccines do elicit different levels of antibody response, and there are difficulties in comparing as well, because each company, when they did the clinical trials, they use different assays, different standards, different cutoffs, different definitions. So it becomes a little difficult to compare. But when you try to standardize those, you do see a range of antibody responses. And for example, we know the mRNA vaccines, the BioNTech, Pfizer, and the Moderna, they elicit a very high antibody response. They also have very high efficacy. But that's not the whole story, because many of the vaccines, even if they don't elicit high antibodies, are also stimulating the other arm of the immune system, which is called the cell-mediated immune response, or the T-cell immunity. And so the reason we see good protection from many vaccines, even though they may have different levels of antibodies that they're inducing, is because they're also activating the other part of the immune system, which is the part of the immune system. The cell-mediated immunity is what protects us from getting bad pneumonia, protects the lungs, protects us from getting really sick. So it's complex. The immunology of the vaccines is complex. And over a period of time, I think what will be important is to see how long does the protection last from different vaccines. And it's possible that some vaccines will do better than others. And as we get more vaccines that are being developed and we start using more, it's possible that some vaccines will be found to be better than others. And then when we have enough supplies, and then at that point, we could have the luxury of being able to choose. But as of now, it's important to get some vaccine, because that's what's going to protect us now in the short term.
Thank you so much for explaining that to us. Here is the next question from Gray Fikipu, who is watching us on Facebook. How do we mitigate our risk when our individual countries and regions lower protective restrictions based on vaccination rates, and not necessarily due to lower infection and transmission rates of new variants?
Yes, Gray, that's a really good question. And I think this is where the responsibilities of both governments and individuals comes in. And as you rightly point out, we have our individual responsibilities and also an awareness of what's happening around us. Everybody can see the data now. There are enough data platforms and websites that can show you which country has how many infections, etc. So it's a really good idea to protect yourself, to protect your family and friends and loved ones, to continue to have to behave responsibly, to do the things we know reduce transmission. But this depends from country to country. There are countries today with very low infection rates where it's quite reasonable to have less restrictions in public. There are other countries with high infection rates or increasing infection rates, where it's really important that people actually are very careful for the coming months. So again, it's not that one size fits all countries, but in general, I think you raise an important issue of responsible behavior. Clearly, we are not through this pandemic. The world is not through the pandemic. And till everyone in all countries has access to vaccines and is protected, this virus can mutate, it can change. As we've seen, variants can emerge, new variants can come back into countries which think that they've finished with the pandemic. So this is why, the WHO has been saying that no one is safe until everyone is safe. So let's continue to keep that safe behavior going for some time.
Thank you so much. Some of our viewers are asking whether mixing different type of vaccines could be a better solution for higher protection from emerging variants.
Yeah, and this is again a very hot topic of research. There's emerging data. There's some early studies now, particularly looking at the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer vaccines, because those actually are the two vaccines that are most used globally. So there have been some studies, mostly conducted in Europe, which have shown that if somebody gets a AstraZeneca vaccine, Oxford vaccine, followed by the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, that there is increase in reactogenicity, which means that the minor side effects you get from pain and fever and swelling is a little bit higher, but also the antibody response is a bit higher, which is really good. So we only have this data for now, and what our guidance says about the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine is that the data now exist to show that somebody who gets the first dose of AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine can get the second dose of Pfizer, that it's safe, it's immunogenic, it results in a good antibody response, it should result in good efficacy, and we're waiting for data on other vaccine combinations. So again, important area for research.
Thank you so much. As you mentioned some of the minor side effects, one of our LinkedIn viewers was asking actually what are COVID-19 vaccine side effects, if you can elaborate. And there was one more specific question: does COVID-19 vaccine does it affect HIV treatment?
Okay, let's start with that specific question. COVID vaccine should not interfere in any way with HIV treatment. I can't see why it would. So it's absolutely fine to go ahead and take it. In fact, there are no drugs that you're taking that are contraindications for the vaccine. As far as side effects are concerned, most of the COVID vaccines can give you minor side effects, like you can get a bit of pain at the injection site, you can get low-grade fever, sometimes even high fever for a day or two, you can have headache, you can feel tired, and then you basically get back within 48 hours to being fine. These are minor, these are common. There are some more severe side effects which are very rare. For example, with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and also with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, there have been rare side effects of clotting disorder that's been reported. 1 in 200,000, 1 in 300,000 people. So those clearly are rare. If they're identified early, they can be treated. There have also been reports of some heart inflammation, myocarditis, following the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Again, that appears to happen in young, otherwise healthy people. There's some symptoms, but all of them have recovered so far. So when we talk about vaccines, we always have to think about benefits and risks. And there are risks, but they're very rare. The benefits are huge today because most people are much more, it's much higher risk to get the COVID infection and to get complications. You get the same clotting disorders 30 times more common if you get natural infection than if you get it from the vaccine. So when you balance it like that, in most countries, for most people, the benefits of vaccines far outweigh the risks.
Thank you so much. And speaking of some clots, here's a question: if stroke patients can take COVID-19 vaccines?
Yes, I mean, most of the time, yes, because in fact, stroke patients are likely to be older, they're likely to have other underlying illnesses, comorbidities like hypertension or other kinds of heart disease, and we know they are the people at highest risk of developing severe disease after COVID. So yes, in most cases they should be able to. However, if there's some underlying clotting disorder, then they should consult their doctor before they take the vaccine. But having had a stroke in the past is not a contraindication.
Thank you so much. Here's a question about how long the immunity after vaccines, especially 2 doses of a Pfizer vaccine, last. As far as I know, we are still to find out that the research is ongoing, but maybe you can clarify once again.
That's right. So of course, the first doses of vaccines were given starting in December 2020, right, in the rollout. So we're still only 6 months after administration. So what's happening is that people who enrolled in the clinical trials are being followed up Also, cohorts of people who've received the vaccine in different countries are being followed up. As of now, things actually look quite encouraging in terms of the length of the immune response. We hope that the immune response will be a minimum of 1 year, but it may probably last much longer than that, because I mentioned we have both the B cells, which is antibodies, and the T cells, which is the cell-mediated immune response. And some recent work has shown that the cell-mediated immune responses can last for a long time. And then, when people are exposed to the virus again, those cells immediately get activated and protect you. So we have to keep fingers crossed, but it looks as though vaccine-induced immunity will last longer than a year, 2 years, maybe 3. We don't know. We have to follow up. But we'll also may know that some vaccines are doing better than others. So all of this will come only with continued follow-up and research.
Thank you very much. Some of the viewers are also concerned or interested to know whether to be protected from Delta variant, we would need a third dose or a booster dose. And here is a bit more concrete question. When will a determination be made regarding booster requirements?
Yes, so the need for the booster obviously is linked to the waning of immune response. If you have a strong immune response that continues for a long time, you don't need a booster. So again, this question cannot be answered just now, because we just don't have that length of follow-up to know when those antibodies start dropping, when do people become prone to infection again. There's some interesting insights we can get from the natural history studies that have been done in a few countries, where people have been followed up, like healthcare workers or even an entire population, and they have observed these people's antibody levels and also when they get infection the second time. And it's been found that reinfection is pretty rare. So if you get infection the first time, majority of people seem to be protected for at least 10 months or so. The older the person, or if there's some underlying immune compromised condition, then antibodies could wane. And that's the group we really need to be looking at closely to see if boosters are needed, and if so, when, how frequently the boosters are going to be needed. So yes, so as of now, we have no recommendation on boosters, but obviously it also depends on how strong an immune response you get in the beginning. And it's likely the stronger the immune response, the longer it's going to last. So again, vaccines may perform differently on the length of protection, but this is still being looked at.
Thank you so much. Here is the next question from Lee Ann Thorson, watching us on Facebook. Where can we find data on pregnancy rate in women after they are fully vaccinated? There have been some concerns on fertility rate and impact of vaccination, so maybe we can address that concern once again.
So firstly, I think we should tell Leanne and other viewers that we don't have any reasons to believe that any of the vaccines are going to affect fertility or potency in men or in women. And this is because there's no biological mechanism or plausibility why a vaccine that has a spike protein of the virus, which is only stimulating immune response against that protein, would in any way impact fertility. So I think your question is probably related to that. And I don't think there's any data on this, but there are lots of animal studies, and there are also studies coming out of countries that have been vaccinating people where women either have been pregnant or have gotten pregnant and have had safe pregnancies. So as of now, there are no concerns around either fertility or pregnancy. But again, it's good to know for each specific vaccine what those recommendations are and guidelines are.
Thank you so much. Speaking of pregnancy, there is the next question if WHO advises pregnant women to get some of the COVID-19 vaccines.
Yeah, so what WHO says is that it's really important if pregnant women are at high risk that they should receive the vaccine. So either if they live in a country or a community with lots of ongoing transmission. We also know from data now that people who are pregnant, women who are pregnant and get infected, have a higher risk of developing severe disease, and they have a higher risk of their child also having a worse outcome, like a premature delivery or a low birth weight delivery. So we do recommend that wherever women are at high risk, for example, a woman healthcare worker, or women who are living in high transmission areas, should be offered the vaccine. On specific vaccines, we have, of course, recommendations, but as of now, there is none of the vaccines for which we have said that it cannot be used in pregnancy.
Thank you so much. And there is a question as well about children. Is Pfizer vaccine recommended by WHO to be used for children above 12 years old?
Yes, so the only vaccine for which there is data on children is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, for which there is now a recommendation that it can be used in children above 12. And there may be children who are especially prone to this, to COVID complications because of their underlying illnesses. So it could be that a few children should be in that priority group that get that vaccine if it's available. But on the whole, what we're saying is that children are not the highest priority group for vaccination because their risk of severe illness is very, very low compared to older people. And because we're still in a situation of global supply shortage, we need to prioritize those who are at high risk of dying after getting COVID. So the elderly, the ones with the underlying illnesses, the healthcare workers, the frontline workers, before we open up, the vaccination program to children. So again, scientifically, the studies are being done for most of the vaccines to see if they're safe and effective, to see if the dose that's to be used in children is lower or the same dose. As those studies become available, we will make that information available so that if children need it, they can be given. But at the same time, the bigger picture, the ethical imperative is to first vaccinate high-risk groups before going to children who mostly have mild disease.
Thank you so much. Here is the next question regarding children and COVID-19 from a viewer on LinkedIn. What is the probability of children getting infected in the third wave, and how can we protect them now?
Yes, so children, of course, can get and have been infected. So studies that have been done in some countries that have looked at antibody levels in the population have found almost the same rates of infection in children as in adults. The reason why it's never detected is because most of them have very mild or even asymptomatic disease. So you don't even realize that the child has been infected. Of course, very rarely they can get ill and they can have some post-COVID complications as well, but it's much, much rarer. So again, in forthcoming waves, it's possible that children will be infected. The other thing that could happen as countries start vaccinating from their oldest groups and come progressively down, then of course, when you have an outbreak, the younger people are the ones who are more likely to be susceptible because you've protected the older people through vaccination. So you may start seeing more infections in younger people, young adults, adolescents, and children. But there's nothing to say that a particular variant or a virus is going to infect children more than adults. It's just who's protected in the population and who's not.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya. Here is a question from Nikki Denton watching us on Facebook. There are some people that have gotten the vaccine and that there aren't any antibodies. Why?
So I think it's really important to know that you cannot just get an antibody test done in your local lab as a marker of vaccine protection, because the antibodies that have to be measured are neutralizing antibodies and they have to be measured using a particular methodology. So I think it may be quite misleading to get an antibody from a local lab and then get worried about whether or not you have protection. And so that basically we don't recommend that. And it's likely that even if you don't find the antibodies in your blood, we know that the cells should have seen the antigen and should have got the memory of that antigen. So the next time they see that antigen, they should be able to respond.
Thank you so much. And here's a question from someone watching us on LinkedIn. It's said that person infected by COVID-19 don't need to take a shot. Any thoughts on the same from you?
Well, our guidance is that even if you've had COVID, it's better to take the vaccine. You can wait for some time. You don't have to take it right away. So you can wait even up to 6 months because we know you'll have some immunity after your natural infection. But it's good to have the vaccination after that. Some countries are actually now recommending that one dose may be sufficient after a natural infection, because the vaccine dose then acts as a booster and you get your high levels of antibodies. But as of now, again, we're still reviewing the evidence, and our recommendation, WHO's recommendation, is to get a full course of vaccination after infection, after waiting to become completely well, but you can wait up to 6 months.
Thank you so much. We got several questions about precautionary measures after vaccination, and one of our viewers specifically was asking, is it because of variants that we need to continue to wear a mask, keep the distance and measures after vaccination?
So a couple of reasons why we need to do that. The first is that vaccines protect you from getting severely ill if you get the infection, may not protect you against infection. So you could still get the infection, you could still transmit it. Some vaccines are better than others at protecting you against infection, but maybe 70-80%. The second reason is that not everyone in the population is immunized in most countries. And therefore you have a lot of susceptible people who can get infected and who can be spreading it to others. So when you're mixing with people, it's very hard to know who's vaccinated and who's not. So it's generally much safer that everybody keeps their masks on, particularly if you're in an indoor setting. If you can't maintain physical distance, continue to wash your hands. And these are good practices, not just to reduce the risk of COVID, but also to reduce the risk of catching other respiratory infections. In fact, we've seen in the last year and a half that the influenza outbreaks have been extremely low. There have been hardly any influenza outbreaks we normally see in the winter season in the northern hemisphere and then again in the southern hemisphere. So because everyone is taking these precautions, influenza has disappeared. So it's good for other respiratory infections as well too.
Thank you so much. Our LinkedIn viewers are very active today. Thank you for that. The next question is also from LinkedIn. Is there any possibility that we will get a vaccine like polio, which gives us a long-time immune response against COVID-19?
Yeah, great questions today from the viewers. Yeah, everyone's become a scientist now. So this is what we would love as well. We would love to have a vaccine that is a single shot, protects you for life. And that's what scientists are working towards. So you mentioned polio vaccine, and the oral polio vaccine, because it's live and because it goes in through the gut, it really has a very good immune response, and it protects the mucosal epithelium. So this is exactly what people are trying now with nasal vaccines, because if you can stimulate immunity in the respiratory tract of the nose, then you may be able to block the virus actually from entering. So a combination of mucosal immunity and systemic immunity may be the way to achieve long-lasting immunity. And I think that there's a good chance that we can get there, because we've been so successful at developing vaccines against this virus that I think tweaking some of them or mix and match kind of approaches might give us long-lasting protection. But the next few months will give us much more on the science.
Thank you so much. Speaking of science, one of the viewers is asking, is there any update of nasal vaccine?
So we have a couple of nasal vaccines that have now finished their phase 1 and are ready to go into the larger trials, the phase 2 and 3. The phase 1 data looks good, stimulating a very good immune response, both in the nose and in the blood. So in fact, the Solidarity trial, we're planning to include 2 nasal vaccines in that trial, hopefully to test the efficacy. And then, so yes, there's a great development there, and also with some oral vaccines.
And going back to Delta variant before we close, Dirai Vasnik was asking, what is the incubation period of the Delta variant?
It's more or less the same. I'm not aware that it's any different. I don't think there's any data to indicate that it lasts longer. We do know that it's more infectious. It can give you a higher viral load, but I think the incubation period remains the same. Up to 14 days, and also the period of infectiousness also seems to remain about the same, and that's why our guidance on the period of quarantining hasn't really changed.
Thank you very much. And maybe the last question from Argentina. We are starting to have COVID-19 plus influenza and pneumonia. Is it appropriate to get vaccinated for all of the three potential infections?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think it's good to have the influenza vaccination as well as the COVID vaccine and any other vaccines for pneumonia that may be available against pneumococcal or against H influenza pneumonia. If it's there in the national program and available, it's good to have, because yes, all of these can cause respiratory illness, and it's good to be protected.
Thank you. And the very last question before we close today from Ruby Suarez. How long does it take for the body to develop antibodies after receiving the vaccine?
So after the first dose of the vaccine, most people start developing antibodies in about 14 days. You can start seeing the antibodies, and then it continues to increase. And then if it's a 2-dose schedule, you get your second dose. And within about 2 weeks of the second dose, you should have that high level of antibodies. So good protection even after the first dose for most vaccines. After the second dose, after 2 weeks, you should be well protected.
Thank you very much, Dr. Soumya, for your time. I also thank our viewers from India, Bahrain, Malaysia, Lebanon, Costa Rica, Rwanda, South Africa, Portugal, Chile, Bangladesh, Brazil, Nicaragua, Barbados, Turkey, Cameroon, Germany, US, and many others that have been listed here for sending your questions. I hope we answered and clarified your concerns about variants of concerns and vaccines efficacy, and especially on recommendations on vaccination of children at the moment. If you would like more information, please visit our website, and also stay in touch with our social media channels and follow the latest updates. Until next week, stay safe. Thank you.